I'm Caleb, and my buddy needs a new Outfeed assembly table, so let me show you how you can make this too.
3/4 inch plywood is a bit much for me to manhandle on the table saw by myself, but I didn't feel like breaking out my track saw and dealing with getting it clamped up perfectly. So I used my material mate and Outfeed supports to shuttle all the sheets from the truck onto my saw, and that actually worked out really well. My buddy Andrew designed this and gave me a cut sheet and cut diagrams. So as I broke down the material, I labeled everything to keep track of what piece it was and what cuts were left to make on it. Kind of like a job card. I ended up with a lot of pretty similar sized pieces, so that was really helpful to keep them straight. Once the pieces were broken down, the next cuts were to establish the toe kick that runs down the long sides of the Outfeed table. Instead of all pocket holes, as I usually do, this build uses rabbets and dados. For me, the trick to good dados and rabbets or grooves is to take plenty of time to get everything set up. I make a lot of test cuts until I know that my dado stack is at the right thickness, that it's the right height above the table, and that it's the proper distance from the fence for each cut. One of the advantages of that is the joinery aligns itself. With pocket holes, I have to take care to hold or clamp everything into position and then try to not let the screw pull it out of place because it goes in at a little bit of an angle. But with rabbets and dados, the only place for the pieces to go is in place. And now to start assembling. The base has 3 sections. A section for the horizontal drawers, section for the vertical drawer, and the shelf section. Then, of course, the top sits on top of all that. I start putting the base together by building the shelf assembly that's going to be on the end of the assembly table. All of the dado rabbet joinery will be glued together, and I'm using brad nails to hold them together until the glue dries. After I got the shelf assembly together, I remembered it needed holes for the shelf pins. Fortunately, my driver and the bit fit in between the shelf verticals, but it might have been smarter to drill these before putting it all together. Now I'm working on the section for the horizontal drawers. I start with an end piece and add a bottom into the dado, and then a back piece into the rabbet. After I get those glued and tacked into place, I add more glue to the bottom and back so I can insert those into the divider between the horizontal and vertical drawer sections. At this point, I realize I won't be able to brad nail the bottom and back piece for the vertical drawer section into that divider, so I add some pocket holes to those to hold them tight while the glue dries. Alternatively, I could have just clamped them, but I wanted to be able to keep moving. Then I put glue on the divider, tapped the bottom into place and screwed it down, added the back piece, brad nailed it to the bottom piece, and screwed it in as well. Now I add the divider between the vertical drawer that'll become the back of the shelf assembly. Some glue and brad nails hold it on, then I add more glue before squeezing the shelf assembly into place and screwing in the pocket holes. I add some braces at the cabinet opening to secure the top and keep everything square. To make sure these actually make the piece square, I measure and cut them based on the span at the back of the cabinet and then pocket screw them into place in the front of the cabinet. Now for the kickboard toe plate thingy. I basically screw together a giant horseshoe and then glue, brad nail, and pocket screw it to the bottom of the whole assembly. This provides some rigidity to the structure, but mostly it's going to make sure that dust collects at the base instead of under the table. Then I moved on to assembling the drawer boxes. These are super simple, just all 1/4 inch plywood, and I glued and brad nailed them together. I also went ahead and built the vertical drawer. This was a bit different, but it's pretty simple. It's kind of like an I-beam, but with a back piece and some padding on the bottom for the drawer slides to get mounted to. When I install the drawers at the end, I'll add fronts to all of them. And onto the top. Andrew wanted a torsion box for his top, which is a way to make a top that is very strong and stays flat. It's basically just a frame between 2 skins. The top of the top will be maple plywood to match the base, but for the internal frame and bottom, I used MDF for stability. First, I marked out where the frame would go on the bottom piece, and then set to gluing and nailing all of the little pieces of the frame together. I thought staples would be the best way to go, but they kept blowing out the sides of the 1/2 inch MDF, so I switched to brad nails. If you've been around, you know I normally use a battery-operated brad nailer. I still love that thing, but I knew I'd be driving several hundred nails pretty quickly, so I pulled out my old pneumatic because it's faster and a good bit lighter. If you're enjoying this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comment box what you like. And if you don't like it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comment box what you don't like. The top of the top will have some T-track in it, so before I add it to the torsion frame, I set up my dado stack and cut some dados for the T-track. As always, the trick here is lots of test cuts to nail that perfect fit. But I did notice some chip out while I was cutting the dados. I started adding blue tape where the cut would go, and that helped a lot to reduce the tear out, but it didn't eliminate it. So I'll just wood putty that later and that'll clean it up. After I handled the tear out, I used a chisel to clean up where some of the dados teed into other dados. I stopped those cuts a bit short to make sure I didn't overshoot the groove, but that did leave a little bit of waste to be cleaned out. To attach the top to the rest of the torsion frame, I used a ton of wood glue. I wanted to make sure that these had really good adhesion and any of the squeeze out is just going to get trapped inside the frame, so I was pretty liberal. It took a while to make sure that the top was squared up properly to the frame, and then I added some brad nails to make sure that it didn't slip around at all and was held down tight for the glue to dry. But the sides of the top are pretty ugly. That's where trim comes in. And fortunately, Andrew is jumping on the #unnecessary walnut wagon, so that's what I used to trim it. After I milled it down, and I have a whole video on my milling process, if you're not familiar, I'll flash a card up for that. I set about mitering the frame around the outside of the torsion box. I like to measure each piece in place and then sneak up on the best fit. Once I get there, it's time for glue and brad nails. Because this is MDF and plywood torsion box, there's not going to be any expansion or contraction, so a miter trim like this is not going to be a problem like it would be on, say, a tabletop. The fit up between the trim and the top was pretty typical for me. So as I used wood putty on the nail holes, I went ahead and tried to fill the gap between the trim and the top too. That's kind of obvious as you see me cutting the trim boards to match the dados. Sometimes I get asked why not install the trim and then cut the dados to prevent having to do it later. Well, on this piece I couldn't safely move with it all together, and I could have assembled it and then used a router, but routers are super messy and my table saw has pretty good dust collection, so that's the way I like to work. By the time I finished opening the dados, the putty was pretty dry and I was able to sand it all down. Then came the fun part, installing the T-track. I installed this on my last bench and really like having it. So when Andrew asked about this, I recommended using the T-track and the rockler clamps. He's been using it for a bit and he says he loves it too. I didn't want any finish getting in the dados and ruining the fit for the T-track, so I installed them before finishing, which meant I needed to mask them off. No big deal. For the finish, I'm using TotalBoat's Amber Halcyon finish. One of the things I really like is that it's water-based, which means low VOC, the stuff you don't want to breathe, quick dry time, and easy cleanup, which is super handy because I'm going to be spraying it on with my new Erlex 5500 spray station. So being able to clean up the gun with just water makes the cleanup almost as easy as applying the finish. When I sprayed, I started with the back of the vertical cabinet to get the gun dialed in, which was super easy, and then I just sprayed the whole project. The only downside was I got stuck trying to spray on a really windy day, and just trust me, don't try to spray on a windy day. Fortunately, I found out the Erlex 5500 has so little overspray that I could have done the whole thing inside, which is what I actually did with the top when I realized that was going to work just fine. With the Erlex and Halcyon, I was able to get 3 coats on everything in an afternoon, which is a total game changer for my finishing process. It's really coming together now, so it's time to install the drawers. I started with the vertical drawer because it seemed like it'd be the hardest and I wanted to get that out of the way. Working in the small space was a bit of a tight squeeze, but it wasn't too bad and I was able to get everything in without a problem. I'm using AccuRide's push-to-open slides, so you're not going to be seeing any handles or pulls on these drawers. Then I moved on to the horizontal drawers. I like to use spacers to keep my drawer slides in the right place. So I started with the top drawer, and as I installed the drawer slides, I just cut down my spacer. My process is pretty straightforward. I screw the slides to the cabinet using the spacer. Then I use the spacer to help hold the drawer in place and screw the front of the slide to the drawer. Then I use the release tabs to pull the slide apart and finish screwing the drawer side part of the slide to the drawer. Then lather, rinse, repeat until complete. Once the drawers were all in, it was time to add the drawer fronts. I used CA glue and activator to hold the front in place and some pocket screws to permanently attach the front to the vertical drawer. I do the same thing for the horizontal drawers, but I'll just be using regular wood screws from the inside to permanently attach those fronts. The last thing I did at my shop was add the leveling feet to the bottom of the cabinet. They just screw on and are invaluable if your floor isn't level, and, well, I've never seen a level floor. Off camera, we moved the whole thing to Andrew's shop and set the top in place, which is pretty self-explanatory. Then I set about securing the top to the base. I just ran some screws through the top of the shelf assembly, through the cleats I put in the front of the drawer area, and through some pocket holes that I drilled. And with that, she's done. Well, she still needs some shelves to be cut for the shelf cubbies, but otherwise, it's ready to use. I hope you enjoyed this, and don't forget I have plans available. I've done several other workbenches before, so if you're looking for more ideas, be sure to check them out. I hope you're inspired to make something, learn something, or were at least entertained. And until next time, make time to make something.